In chapter 2 of Pirkei Avot, we have in the middle of the chapter that Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai received from Hillel and from Shammai. The problem with its placement in chapter 2 is that it really belongs in chapter 1. After Hillel and Shammai, chapter 1 concludes with the words of Rabban Gamliel the elder, his son Shimon ben Gamliel, and then Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Several generations of descendants of Hillel, not the direct descendants, because the first descendant of Hillel is Shimon. After Shimon comes Gamliel the first. And after Rabban Gamliel, we have Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who was murdered by the Romans. And then we have Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the son of Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, who is not mentioned in the first chapter. So we missed the first generation after Hillel. We mentioned the second, the third, and the fifth generation after Hillel. All the while, we gloss over the fact that Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai was the last of the students who received from Hillel and Shammai and transmitted the Torah as he received from Hillel and Shammai. So why is Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai relegated to chapter 2? I know we talked a little bit about this with the story of Shammai and Naphtali. How could Shammai and Naphtali, who were, according to the Rambam, Gerei Tzedek, converts, how could they have been in charge of the Sanhedrin? And what I answered was that there are two different aspects to the tradition. One is the leadership of the court as a court, and the other is the leadership of the court as the repository of the authority of the Torah, the truth of the Torah, the truth of the tradition. Shammai and Naphtali could have been the heads of the Sanhedrin with regards to the tradition. What did we receive from Moshe? In case anybody had a question, they could go and ask the Sanhedrin Gdolah. The High Court also had a function as the highest court in the land and judged the most severe cases. A king, a high priest, a tribe, a Zokin Mamre, a rebellious elder, all are tried in the High Court of 71. Certain cases can only be brought in front of the 71 judges of the Sanhedrin Gdolah, the great Sanhedrin. Those cases of jurisprudence, Shammai and Naphtali most likely did not sit on, even though they were sitting when Herod was judged by the Sanhedrin, but there, since Herod was a convert may sit on a bezdin of another convert. But there is no proof that Shammai and Naphtali sat in the court when the adjudication was on Jewish people born from the tribes, nor is there any proof that they sat on those courts where only the Sanhedrin Gdolah could have jurisdiction, such as with the high priest, or declaring an Ir Hanidachas, a wayward city. So the answer that I gave, how could Shammai and Naphtali have been the heads of the High Court? They were the heads of the Torah authority of the court, not the judicial authority, not an authority of power, but an authority of morality, an authority of the law, authority of the oral tradition coming from Moses. In that same vein, one can say that, and especially since the High Court ceased to function as a High Court during the time right after Hillel, Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai, whose role was to be the connection between Hillel and the subsequent generations, His function was not as judge. His function was not as chief justice. His function was the repository of the knowledge of Torah. The fact that they made certain rabbinic decrees to remember the service of the temple and to protect the law in general, that's a function of the scholarship, not a function of judicial power. And so Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai is relegated to the second chapter because Rabbeinu HaKodesh is hinting that there are two facets to Torah authority. One had a certain amount of authority in government, a certain amount of authority over people's lives. Well, this is the house of the Nasi that was seen as a vestige of the Davidic dynasty. And they had temporal authority to a certain degree over the people. And then there was the aspect of the Sanhedrin as being the repository of the Torah, the place where there would be no doubts, the place where the tradition would be kept. And this was the role of Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. He was the repository of all of the knowledge of the Torah. If there was any question as to what the Torah said about a certain particular topic, we came to Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai to determine the truth. But the temporal element, the element of judging the Kohen Gadol, the element of judging an Ir Nidachas, a wayward city, the element of expanding the borders of Jerusalem and of the temple, these are temporal powers, powers of the authority of the court or the authority of government. This Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai did not enjoy because the nasius, the leadership, the role of quasi-government, quasi-self-government, was taken over by the house of Hillel way before Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai was installed as the heir to Hillel and Shammai. And so that's why chapter 1 ends with the household of Hillel to tell us the authority of the heads of the high court were given to Hillel and his family. The authority of the tradition of the Torah that nobody could replace Rabban Yochanan Ben Zakkai. He was the one who studied under Hillel and Shammai. He was the repository. If we had a question or doubt as to what the law was, we went to him. We didn't go to others, even though they might have been great men. And so we have another proof of this idea of the division of power within the Sanhedrin itself. The Sanhedrin functioned on two different levels, one temporal, one authoritative, the other completely spiritual and Torah-based. And this explains also chapter 3 why Akavya ben Mahalalel, who's mentioned in the beginning of the third chapter, was offered to be the Nasi, the head of the high court. How could he be offered the Nasius? The answer is because this was at a time when Shmai and Naphtali were the heads, and they couldn't judge, and therefore had to have someone else in charge.